It is just an honor to get to talk with you, Michael. Your work, not only in the startup world, but your philanthropic work is inspiring, and it's such a great story, especially for this moment in American and global history. The work you do really does matter, and the hand that you have had in creating some of the greatest startups this country has ever produced is just astonishing. And I thought maybe we could start with talking about what, for our international audiences who don't know what Y Combinator. So you're the CEO and co-founder of Y Combinator. So why don't you walk us through what
sounds like someone's got to mute their phone here.
There's an echo chamber.
That sounds better.
Is that better?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so what I was saying is, really the work and the companies and the startups that come through Y Combinator, they're all very storied founders and really great success stories. But maybe tell us what Y Combinator is.
Sure. So YC is a community of about, I think someone's got to mute their line. There we go. YC is a community of about 5,000 startup founders. That was started about 15 years ago. And it started as a simple startup accelerator, which is a 3-month program that you apply to attend. And we fund every company, give them advice, and then present them to investors at the end of the 3 months in order to raise additional money. It's kind of expanded since the beginning. So now we actually try to provide services to our founders from even before when they apply, where we have this program called Startup School, to after they leave the accelerator. We have a variety of different programs that help companies as they're continuing to grow. So we try to help you for the entire life cycle of your company.
And so right now, and I want to get to some of your other work in a second, but how are you mentoring, how are you adjusting to the pandemic and sort of like this strange period that we're in? How are you advising startups?
Well, I would say that the program has changed quite a bit because it's not in person. We've adjusted the program completely remote. We've had some experience because the last batch we ran ended remotely. And so we got some firsthand experience helping founders raise money during a completely remote world. In terms of the day-to-day, what startups need to do to succeed, to be honest, not much of the advice has changed at all. We fund almost exclusively software companies. So strangely, there's a bit of a phenomenon where a lot of people are a lot more easy to get in touch with now. And you can kind of assume people are in front of their computers and don't have any private lives anymore. So in some ways, it's easier. If your company is impacted by not being able to go outside or not being able to operate during COVID, unfortunately, there's nothing we can really do about that. So I can't say the advice has changed that much.
Yeah, no, I get that. And I think that, if you are a technology company or a software company and you can't figure out how to do the remote virtual thing, there's a problem. You know what I mean? Like, it's how the technology industry is wired, so to speak. And you advise a lot of startups. I mean, that's really what your history's been. But I wanted to ask you a question without getting, deep into the rabbit hole of politics. But one of the things that really stood out to me on your story and on your CV is that you are very deeply a part of increasing diversity among startup founders. And, at this moment in history where everything is so raw and sensitive, I just wondered if you could tell us why this is important, especially right now.
So I think that I was really taken by the story of YC and the way it was structured. I grew up on the East Coast of the US and had no access to the technology world. Didn't know a single tech investor. I didn't know what a venture capitalist was. I didn't know how to start a company. I didn't know how to hire a lawyer. Didn't know really anything. And before YC, if you wanted to get involved in startups, you actually had to know someone. And that felt, I think that felt, well, it's interesting. I don't even know how that felt because I didn't know what I was missing because I didn't even know what existed. And a couple of my friends, Justin and Emmett, were reading the blog of this guy named Paul Graham when he launched YC. And the entire attitude was different. You apply like you apply to college. So you don't have to know anyone at a college to get in. The terms of the investment are up front. So you don't spend the first interaction with the investor negotiating from different sides of the table. And you were given a cohort of other founders to learn from. So you weren't kind of attacking this alone or just with your small team. And to me, what I saw was, over the following 10 years, was a decade worth of founders who really wouldn't have been able to access Silicon Valley without YC. And to me, it just felt more fair. And so a lot of the work that I wanted to do was spread the word about YC to communities that historically don't have the ability to start businesses or who historically don't have relatives or friends who can inform them of what opportunities exist in the startup world. And that's been some of my most fun work.
And how would you, at the end of the day, how do you evaluate the success of increasing the diversity efforts among founders? How do you measure that?
It's really hard to measure.
Yeah, it is.
There are simple things like the number of people who apply, the number of people who get in, so on and so forth. But the reality is that startup is far more like sports, where there are a lot of people who want to be basketball players, but very few who will be successful.
Right.
And so a lot of it is actually around just awareness. I failed if somebody who wants to break into the startup world doesn't know that YC exists.
Right.
I don't see it as my job to convince someone to do a startup. Trying to convince someone to be a professional athlete, it's probably a bad idea unless you're a certain kind of crazy. So it's safer to be a doctor or a lawyer or some other thing. But if you're that kind of crazy, I want you to know that we're here for you.
And there is a lot of crazy in Silicon Valley and a lot of crazy, just startups. I mean, it's an insanely challenging path to choose. And to go back to something you just said, which I think is really, really important, is the topic of failure and how you coach your startups and Y Combinator about failure. When do you know when it's time to quit? How do you teach that?
What's interesting is that I actually think I see this changing over the last 15 years. I think that in the past, it was far more likely that I would see a startup where the founders would start taking a level of sacrifice that was almost irrational based on the progress they're making.
Yeah.
I actually think the trend is different now. I think as startups have become more popularized, people have a false understanding of how much work it takes to be successful. And so it's far more often that I see people changing an idea, changing what they're working on too rapidly without understanding that it takes time to do anything really well. And with the expectation that if they build the right thing, their startup will turn into Facebook overnight, which no startup does that, or very few, I'll say.
Right. So the topic of failure, in Silicon Valley is embraced, right? If not celebrated, right? There's FailCon. There's a whole conference dedicated to failure. But when you get outside of the boundaries of the United States, failure is not embraced. It is a very novel concept to, take failure and teach other people about your failure. And what are your words of advice? Because this is a very international audience that we're speaking to today, like understanding and learning from failure. Like what is your message and your advice?
Well, I'll take a step back and say, no founder or company is tied to where they start. And I think every founder has to figure out how to put themselves in an environment where they're most likely to succeed.
Right.
So sometimes when I talk to founders and they tell me they're in an environment that's not really supportive of them doing a startup, the first thing I ask them is, why don't you move?
Right.
You know, I was on the East Coast of America and it wasn't supportive of doing startups. So I imagine most places in the world, it's very, very hard to do a startup. One of the things I love about Startup Istanbul is it creates a little pocket, and there's so many other organizations that create a little pocket of other people doing startups too, so that you feel like you're normal.
Right.
And you can kind of create a little culture and ignore what's going on around you.
Right.
But I'll say that, like, it's not society's job to make a comfortable environment for you to do a startup. And so if where you are is the challenge, you got to leave.
Right.
And there are lots of places to go where the environment's better.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting right now in this country and in the world, looking at, you know, I hate this term, but I'm going to use it anyway, and I'm going to, you know, kind of cringe as I'm saying it, but entrepreneurial ecosystems can really have a powerful impact on, you know, hyper-local and global economics. And you look at some of the things that are going on in Croatia and, you know, Denmark, and, you know, there's really a lot of money, and largely government money, funding entrepreneurial ecosystems. And I think it's really, really important because, I mean, right now, I think around the world, we need hope and we need, you know, a cause. We need to have purpose. And I think that's why, you know, when I look at, you know, what your body of work and the work of other entrepreneurs and Airbnb, who I know you've worked with, you know, it really is inspiring, and it's just a really great story. And I just wonder if you have, like, what you're like coming from, you know, your incredible background, and you've, you know, been a part of so many exciting things. Like, what your take on all of this is.
Yeah, I guess maybe I would say this very simply, is that I think that if you decide to be a founder, you're joining a global community, not a national one or a local one.
Right.
And I think, you know, YC now is somewhere between 40 and 50% international founders every batch. And many people kind of use YC to build a connection to Silicon Valley that they take back home with them. And so I would just encourage people to think outside of their local box. Like, you know, you're playing on the internet, you're playing with everyone. And you can consume resources from other ecosystems, even if you're not physically in them, or if you can't physically stay.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And you know, I'm sure you have experienced this, and, you know, I would love to get your take on, you know, founders do not always make the best CEOs, right? And, like, how do you teach, or can you, I don't know if this is a philosophical question, but how do you teach leadership going through Y Combinator? What are the tenets of leadership?
You know, I would say we don't.
Yeah.
I would say, weirdly, like, it's a lucky few founders who have the opportunity to lead a large number of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the thing that we try to teach that's kind of a hidden quality of leadership is we try to teach founders not to lie to themselves. There's this phrase that we use a lot in YC called magical thinking, which is, you know, looking at a body of evidence and not drawing the, like, very clear conclusion, because it's not a conclusion you agree with. And I think a lot of the time, startup founders want to believe that the plan that they start with is the right plan. And, you know, as we've dealt with so many startups, it's become extremely clear that the plan that you start with is just the plan that you start with. And most people, if they follow the plan that they start with, will fail. So a lot of the time, we really spend trying to encourage people to talk to their customers and update their plan with new information and not lie to themselves. Because you never have the opportunity to lead a lot of people if you don't actually figure out how to build something people want. And I would argue that like the number one failure mode of companies is they're not building something that people want. Nowadays, once again, the startups are so popular, a lot of founders want to skip to what we call company building, hiring, interviewing, managing, leading. And they almost think that by building a company, it'll allow them to make something people want. But almost always making something that people want is first, and then company building is second. So oftentimes we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about that, especially in the accelerator program. We actually have other programs later on. Specifically, there's a program called the YC Growth Program that deals with companies who are 30 to 50 people growing quickly and have figured out how to make something people want. And now the CEO's job is shifted to being exclusively company building. And we actually have a small program for those CEOs. It's about 10 to 20 people a couple times a year. We'll bring a lot of YC CEOs from later stage companies in to speak to them and to actually kind of give them a crash course in all the other stuff you need to be good at now that you've figured out what people wanted.
I mean, that seems like such a basic concept, but I think it's easy to like get ahead of it. You know what I mean? It just seems like that is like a foundational thing for any startup, but a lot of founders, you know, rush toward the end game. So I mean, I think that's a really good point. And I'm going to ask you one more question. I think, you know, there's nothing you and I can say that is more important than the questions of the audience. But, you know, in your experience, and, you know, you have done so much in a very short amount of time, and even while you're on vacation, which is very admirable, what do you see as the top, you know, 3 qualities of a successful founder?
Well, how about I say a successful team? I think the first quality is being technical. The first quality is being able to actually create the first version of the product that you want people to use. I think the second most important quality of the team is to be irrationally connected. By that I mean, the teams that I see operate the best are the teams that have an irrational desire to work together, even if their startup isn't working right now. So there's something else that's tying them to each other and to the startup, even when the numbers are not moving in the right direction. And then I think the third quality of the team that's really important is having an actual passion for the problem that's being solved. You know, we have this phrase called an MBA startup, where it's a startup where you think there's a great business opportunity, but you don't actually care about the users or the problem or the product. It turns out that those startups often fail because your knowledge of the problem was very, very, very shallow. Once you get deeper and it gets time to work hard and the success doesn't come quickly, you realize, well, yeah, I was interested in this if it was going to go in the beginning, but I'm not interested in a long slog, and you leave. So some connection to the problem, I think is the third best quality of a team.
And I mean, I think that the whole concept of team, I mean, like from your perspective and what you have experienced, I mean, so cultures of excellence, you know, the whole idea of creating a culture, you know, that becomes kind of the brand, like a Google or, you know, many other brands. Like how do you assess that kind of success? I mean, on the early stages of a startup. I mean, is it the idea? Is it the collaboration that you're talking about? Like what sets the tone for that? Or is that something that comes later? I really don't know. I'm just asking.
You know what's interesting? That's an interesting question. Like, I'd say there's two things. I think one is good and one is unfortunate but required. The good one is that every CEO is judged on the team that they put together and the co-founding team. And I think they're judged in non-obvious ways. I think that sometimes, once again, startup people want to be kind of copying the thing that they don't understand, and they think they need to be finding experts. You know, I'll constantly get the question, oh, well, I need my CTO to have 20 years experience managing engineers. Right. And I'll ask the CEO, well, do you have 20 years experience doing anything? And it's like, no. It's like, well, that seems to work for you, but it doesn't work for your CTO. It's almost as if like it's almost as if a lot of people have a base of bad business instincts.
Right.
That they don't know how to ignore. And so, one, you're judging your team. And that's looked at in a lot of different ways. How much equity have you given your co-founders? If you're not giving them that much equity, that means they're not very good. You're not planning to keep them for a very long time, which I think a lot of founders don't understand that's what that looks like. Then I think the second thing is your ability to communicate. I think this is an unfortunate one because, at least for me, it felt like, shouldn't my product and shouldn't the numbers do the talking? Why should I have to be clear in my communication and precise in my communication? And I think the reality is because every human judges every other human based on how they communicate.
Right.
And as a CEO, maybe today that you'll be doing, but the vast majority of your life you'll be talking.
Right.
And so if you can't communicate ideas clearly, you can't sell customers, you can't recruit employees, you can't rally your employees, you can't keep the company on mission, you can't convince investors to give you money. And so, you know, the first question we ask at every YC interview is, you know, what do you do? What does your company do? And it seems like it should be a softball question, but I'd say about 75% of the time, after 2 minutes, it's not clear what the company does.
Right.
And it just goes to show you how hard it is to be a good communicator, because the founder clearly knows what the company does. But putting an idea into someone else's head is actually an extremely powerful thing. And being able to do it only with your words is very powerful. So I think team is the obvious one and is the clear good one. I think communication, at least for me, was the non-obvious one that is also extremely important.
Don't you think it's also like a clarity of your vision? Like being able, which falls under, you know, that mothership of communication, but like the thing, you know, when I'm working with startups and founders, you know, it's very easy to get lost in your overcomplicated thoughts. And I think that, you know, having a very clear vision and being able to state it in 3 sentences or less is key, you know, because if you like, you know, some of the guys that I get pitched, you know, they get lost in the complication of the idea, which is the opposite of what you should be doing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think one of the tricks to communication that we have to hammer into founders is that the way that you talk about your company is different based on the audience that you're speaking to.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's storytelling. Yep.
Yeah, that's storytelling, exactly. And so, you know, we have this thing we say at YC, which is like, what is your investor pitch versus what is your customer pitch?
Right.
And I think that like my instinct and all founders' instincts is to just like cram them into the same thing. Why should I have to remember 2 pitches? It feels inefficient. But it turns out that like your customer wants to understand that you know all the jargon. They want to be able to go deep on details with you. Your customer understands the problem as a user. Your investor most likely doesn't have any of those things.
Right. They don't.
And then if you're talking to a reporter, it's different. If you're talking to an employee, it's different. So I think that like part of being a great communicator is being able to actually have different ways of explaining the same thing and hold all of them in your mind and being able to translate between them at a moment's notice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's key. Like you have to be able to, like you have to. It's like writing a story. Like you write for certain audiences. You pitch to certain audiences, and they're not always the same. And so you have to customize each one of your messages while keeping, you know, a strand of commonality among them, like your story, like this core of your story and the core of your founders. But I'm talking too much, Michael. I'm so sorry. Barak, should we open it up for questions? You were getting some really good questions early on,
I mean,
Michael.
there are lots of questions already being asked. There are, of course, more concrete and material ones, such as how do YC decide whether to invest in a startup that operates in a niche market? What do you look for in the founders who operate it?
I don't really know what a niche market means. So if I were to take a step back and I kind of explain this from a theory perspective, a technology startup can raise a bunch of money from investors because there's a plausible reason why it can become a multi-billion-dollar company. That's the only way the math works for the investor. It turns out that the vast majority of businesses don't qualify. And it doesn't mean that they're bad businesses. It just means that they don't qualify for this very specific type of funding. And so I think that oftentimes that message gets lost to founders. They think to themselves, well, there's this thing I want to do, and I heard these people give money. Why aren't they giving me money? And what they need to understand is that, like, those people can only give money if they can justify to the other people around them that you have a shot at being a large company. So if you are in a small market, the question I'd ask you is why? Why?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why not broaden your horizons? You can always start in a small market, but why be in one country? Why be in one region? It was funny. I was traveling through Europe, and I stopped off in Italy to talk to some founders. And Instacart was just starting up in America, and this founder wanted to create Instacart. And I asked, well, what do you think? How big do you think this could be? And basically he said, well, you know, my wildest dreams is that it covers the entire country of Italy. Now, me as an American, I think to myself, the EU is a big place, but Italy is a small place. If your entire aspiration is just to cover one country in the EU, it's not clear to me that anyone's going to want to give you money. And I think that, like, that was news to him. Because in his mind, Italy was a big place, is where he grew up. And so I think that, like, one of the interesting things about markets that I only learned later is that, you know, in America, we are so lucky to be in a market where everyone speaks the same language. There is a lot of money. Everyone has a similar culture, and it's big geographically. Like, that's an accident. Most other people who are born are not going to be born in the, you know, 5, 6, or 7 markets that are like that. And they've got to create, they can't look at a company in the US and think we can compare one-to-one, because you can't. So it's not a surprise that when you look at where investment dollars go, they're flowing to the US, to China, to India, now to Indonesia.
And by the way,
to Nigeria.
Michael, by these outbreak times, what is your strategy? Should startups can apply to YC, or what should the YC's process will look like in upcoming months? Are they going to come physically to San Francisco, or are you going to go remote fully?
Yeah, so we wrote about this probably about a month and a half ago. YC is completely remote. This batch we got about 12 to 13,000 applications, and we accepted about 240 companies around the world, and the whole program is remote.
And so another question is also there are lots of venture capitals in different parts of the world, such as Middle East, Africa, but there are cultural difficulties. So do you have any insights how to reach and raise, especially in difficult regions?
Yeah, like I said, if you're just a startup, you're participating in a global community, and if you're just consuming local resources, it's not going to work very well. The problem with a lot of investors, no matter where they are, is that you can split investors up into two groups. One is, have they ever been pitched by a successful company that they said no to? And the other is, have they never been pitched by a successful company? You never want to raise or pitch in a community where investors haven't said no and been wrong. Right? The biggest advantage founders have pitching in Silicon Valley is that many investors passed on Facebook. Many investors passed on YouTube. Many investors have passed on the biggest companies in the Valley. Many investors passed on Uber. And so every investor, when they go into the new meeting, they're asking themselves, is this the moment that I'm going to screw up and miss another good company? There are a lot of regions in the country, in the world, where Uber never pitched any VC. Facebook never pitched any VC. Every time the VC has decided not to invest, they've been right. Well, that investor thinks, that investor is a lot harder to convince of anything.
Mm-hmm. And there are lots of questions coming. I'm also reading from the questions. With the changing dynamic in the socio-political space, with countries promoting pro-national products and services, how do you think this will impact investments as the size of effective market shrinks?
So I don't know is the short answer. I think that what I've seen on the ground in Silicon Valley is that the crisis that we're in is fundamentally different from a normal economic crisis.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of money around. Now, what I saw in the end of March was as the US stock market collapsed, investors got very nervous about writing checks. But, you know, the US and the rest of the world started printing money and stock markets are looking good. So I think the immediate effect on investment is really tied in the short term to what the stock market's doing and how comfortable people feel about how much money is in their bank accounts. I think there's another dynamic that I didn't quite understand. When markets, when a fund raises money, they don't actually get the money. They get a commitment to provide the money when they're writing it, when they're making an investment. In a down economy, you feel nervous asking, an investor feels nervous asking their investors for money to invest in you. And so there's like a double dynamic here that I think founders don't realize. They might see a fund that's quote unquote a $200 million fund. That does not mean that fund has $200 million in their bank account. So I think in the short term, a lot is going to have to do with what the economy is doing, what the stock market's doing. I think in the longer term, we'll see, right? If, you know, the structural unemployment in America stays the way it is, the long-term effects are going to be drastic. And I'm sure that's going to affect the startup funding market.
And by the way, following up this question, how will the YC's investments will affected by this outbreak? Are you going to decrease it, or it is going to be increased? The number and value of the investments.
In the short term, nothing's changing. I think that like the reality is that YC kind of sits in a very privileged position where the companies that we fund have a better chance than most companies to raise money. And so even in a situation where money is not flowing as much, I think YC's brand is strong enough that we expect YC companies, good YC companies, to be able to raise money. I do think, though, that like we are probably moving away from a world where people can expect the YC brand alone will bring money. I think we were in very, very frothy times over the last 3 to 4 years. And I think a lot of money was thrown around. And I think regardless of anything, trends before COVID, like, you know, Uber not doing well in the public market and WeWork kind of imploding and SoftBank not doing well, I think some of those trends have really changed how investors look at companies, and they're a bit more critical now than they were in the past 3 to 4 years. So yeah, so I certainly will say that there are some startups that are disappointed that even though they're failing, they don't raise money, which always confused me, because I don't think anyone who was trying to be a professional soccer player would think that if they did really poorly at practice, they would get to play in the game.
And we have lots of questions, but I would like to ask the last one probably, because we have already overpassed 40 minutes. Thank you very much, Michael, by the way. It's a valuable interview. We have lots of questions to ask, but I mean, you are in vacation, so let's keep it short. Happy wife, happy life. You have said, once said that at least 50% of the founders must have a tech. I mean, this is a question from Alessandro. You have once said that at least 50% of the founders must be technical. What skills must the remaining 50% have? I
feel like I kind of answered that question lead up on what makes a good team. I would say, you know, first is technical. Second is an irrational connection to one another. The ability to want to work with one another even on any idea. And third is some deep knowledge about a problem and or some deep connection to the user that you're serving. I think those are the 3 things. I don't want to reduce it to skills. You need a lot of skills to be successful, and people can learn skills. Skills are not static, so it's hard for me to make a list of skills. Each startup requires different skills from their founders at different times.
Perfect. Michael, I mean, this was a great time in the special days. Thank you very much for accepting and also making this call and interview. And we will be very happy to host you in Istanbul again. Hopefully, this outbreak and pandemic completes, hopefully. And then we have to chat in the Bosporus again. In a dinner with Amy. We will also will be very happy to host Amy as well. Amy, also thank you very much for this interview. And
thank you, and thank you, Michael. I just real quick, Barak. I don't mean to interrupt you, but
please
keep doing the work that you are doing is very important right now, and you are inspiring a whole new generation of people. And keep doing it, and anything we can do to support you, we are happy to. So thank you.
I really appreciate it. Sorry for the technical difficulties before.
Yeah,
it was a really great chat.
It happens mainly to people in Silicon Valley. Just Barak and I were talking about, just, you know.
Thank you, Michael. Have a great day.
We got to get better with tech one of these days. All right, talk to y'all later.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Be safe. Bye-bye.